Of research we've been doing over the past several years. Today I'll be talking about a series of 4 different studies. Maybe turn it on again. There it goes. All right. Okay. I'm not advancing. Whatever it's. There it goes. And there we go. Okay, fingers crossed. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background of where I'm coming from, I'll talk a little bit about my larger research program, and then I'm going to highlight one of those lines of research, which is our work on technology-based HIV risk behavior. I'll talk a little bit about a series of 4 different studies that we've been conducting in that, and then I'll talk about a little bit about these new R01s in terms of how that has led or how that has stemmed out of our earlier work. Okay, so my research interest, as Claude mentioned, is largely in the area of LGBT health and specifically HIV prevention. But I've done a whole series of studies over the course of my career, starting out with women and older adults, LGBT youth with Margie Rosario, who many of you will know, as well as more recently with bisexual men, young MSM, and particularly the guys I'm talking about today in terms of users of mobile apps. I also do I've worked kind of through a whole series of different outcomes, including HIV testing, a lot on psychological adjustment and substance use. I even do some dental research on occasion, but primarily interested in condomless sex and now PrEP. Okay. My work takes a very distinctively mixed methods approach. Pretty much all of the studies that I'll talk about today have some sort of inductive and deductive component to it. Typically, this comes in the nature of in-depth interviews as well as online surveys or some combination of the two, as well as, and I'll talk about today, the inductive method of quantitative content analysis as well, and much of this work is longitudinal and over time, although that won't be the focus of my discussion today, given this particular set of findings. Okay? And most recently, my work has focused a lot on the issues of sexual exchange theory, specifically conceptualizing the internet and specifically these hookup apps as the online sexual marketplace where men are marketing themselves and the wares that they have to attract partners. This stems out of Sprecker's sex exchange theory, which originally conceptualized sex as a women's commodity that they could use in exchange for financial security. Okay? But we've actually, and although Sprecher and others have actually argued against the use of sex exchange theory for MSM and other LGBT populations, we actually have argued, I think successfully, to expand sex exchange theory to MSM, and that even though it's same-sex partners, each partner, regardless of gender, is still bringing particular qualities, whether that's attractiveness or youth or financial security, masculinity, penis size, you name it. They're all here. And those things are bartered for in this online sexual marketplace. And what's particular, I think, of interest to me and this group is our usual priorities in terms of HIV status and condom use preferences may get altered in that bartering process for men who have other compensating qualities. So he's gorgeous and attractive, and therefore condoms may not be necessary. So we're looking at all of that in this set of work. Okay, so recently we've been applying that to this area of mobile technology and how it may be contributing to sexual risk. I don't think I need to go over this for most of our crowd here, but just in case, this is these smartphones. We all have one that have kind of become ubiquitous as part of our current American life and increasingly global life. These smartphones actually comprise a growing market share. If you look at the most recent National Pew reports, we have 92% of Americans own a cellular phone. That's both feature phones and smartphones. 68% of Americans own a smartphone, and that is increasing over time, whereas 73% own either a laptop or a desktop, and that has remained steady over the past decade. So smartphones are increasingly becoming more and more part of our lives. So, and the smartphones have really changed how we communicate with other people, other corporations. So we now, with individuals, we're messaging each other on these devices. We are communicating with other companies and other people in terms of the broader world using social media. We don't even need to make a call to order a car service or to order dinner anymore. We have an app for that. So it shouldn't be surprising that, of course, this has also migrated into how we communicate and meet potential sexual partners. So it's in my hand. I'm looking for the coffee, and it's in my hand. My husband says he has the reservation at Shady Pines all ready to go, so I'm taken care of. Anyhow, so there have been a whole series of apps that make use of the GPS technology in the smartphone that allows the app to identify potential users who are geographically closest. Here in New York City, that's often a series of feet away, or certainly fewer than miles. In more rural areas, it's a little bit different. I'm looking forward to actually studying that. The original app was Grindr, with over 3.5 million users. It was founded in 2009, but since then, we've had a whole series of imitators that are doing basically the same thing and make use of the same technology. Okay? But despite the kind of ubiquitous nature of the phones and to many the assumption that these apps are equally ubiquitous, we actually have a number of unanswered questions in terms of how common are these apps in terms of their use, and have they replaced other more traditional sexual venues for MSM in terms of bars or more traditional websites like Craigslist, etc., which of course Craigslist is now kaput, so in terms of personals. There are a number of questions in terms of, does the GPS function and the quick and easy availability of the apps allow men to find more sexual partners, have fewer men attending other sexual venues, and could it facilitate greater sexual risk, either because of increased opportunity or because of some factor of the app itself. And so what is it? And then we also don't know what it is about those apps that may be changing risk behaviors. So we've done a whole series of studies on this. One of the limitations, or the main limitation in my mind, in terms of the existing research, is most of the research that's focused on app use has relied on samples that are recruited from primarily Grindr themselves. Pop-up ads on Grindr, click here, take our survey. As such, we have a 100% Grindr use sample, or some mix with other venues. That is particularly problematic in terms of answering some of these other questions. Because it's only limited to app users, we have no comparison group of non-app users. As such, we can't answer any questions about whether these apps are used more or less than other venues. With a sample like that. It also overrepresents app users relative to the true population and underrepresents users from other potential venues. And we really can't answer any questions about whether app users are more or less risky in a sample that's 100% app users. So to address this limitation, we got funding from NIMH to do an R21 study that was a part of which was a Street-Intercept survey of MSM in New York City. And with our distinctive purple clipboards, we went out in the field and conducted Street-Intercept surveys. Street-Intercept surveys are, in my mind, a particularly useful method here because it allows for a more representative sample in many ways than what we can get through other, particularly online venues. Because we're actively approaching men, it reduces self-referral bias. We don't overrepresent the men who are app users. We also don't underrepresent men. So no matter what hookup or dating app you might recruit from, you're going to underrepresent partnered or monogamous men or sexually inactive men. So by using Street-Intercept survey, we get a more accurate count of that. And it doesn't limit the sample to specific apps. For those of you who are familiar with the apps I said, I pointed out earlier, there are different cultures, and I'll talk about this, of each of the different apps, and they target different subpopulations of the MSM community. And so if you're recruiting only from one, you're getting a very distinctive and potentially unrepresentative subpopulation for that particular, whichever app you happen to be recruiting from.
How can you be sure that street approaches are representative?
Well, so I'll show some data a little bit on that. My main point is these. Is it representative of the true population? Probably not. Is it more representative than recruiting off of Grindr itself? I would argue yes. Okay. So we had our team of 11 staff. We all went out and we recruited self-presenting male individuals on the streets of the West Village, Chelsea, and Hell's Kitchen. We wanted to increase our hit rate a little bit than going to other neighborhoods. We randomly varied the location, which neighborhood, the days and times, so that we get greater geographic representation. We also approached everyone, even though we had the survey was a recruitment tool for a second section of this study. We approached everyone regardless of age, ethnicity, or perceived sexual orientation. And everyone received a Metro card, which was a wonderful recruitment tool. Okay, so we surveyed a total of 986, of whom 617 reported to be MSM. The vast majority of being gay, but we had a large number of reporting bisexual behavior as well. Majority white, but fairly diverse, or more diverse than what you would get from a traditional internet sample. In terms of representativeness, Heino, one of the things we were interested in is, okay, you're only recruiting in the West Village, Chelsea, and Hell's Kitchen. Are you getting a particular affluent white sample in that respect? But actually only 28% of the men who we surveyed reported living in those three neighborhoods. We were actually getting a large group of men, not only from the other boroughs, but even outside of New York City. So tourists, New Jersey, etc. Okay. All right, so based on these data, we saw 86% of men reported owning a smartphone. Notice how that's substantially higher than the 63% that we see nationally. Again, maintaining this, so I maintained the same denominator. This is the entirety of all MSM, not subgroups. So 86% own a smartphone of all MSM, 44% of all MSM surveyed used a GPS app in the past 3 months, Grindr being our most popular. Of then 29% of the men, of all men, had met someone using the app. So you'll see we have a significant number of MSM who are using the app in the past 3 months but have not actually met. But overwhelmingly, those who had met had actually had sex with that partner. Okay. In terms of how does this compare to other venues that the men were using, actually, surprisingly, more men had sex with a man that they had met in the bar in the past 3 months compared to either apps or more traditional internet websites. In terms of take-home message, bars have not been replaced, according to our data here, and the number of partners that men were meeting also did not differ between the three main venues, with then the others being much smaller. Okay. Now, who is actually using these apps? These are our multivariate findings. We find our younger age cohort is more likely those who are gay identified, those who have sex with men only, as opposed to having sex with men and women. African American and Black participants were far less likely to be using the apps. Single men, of course, were more likely to be using the apps. And those who used other hookup websites or other venues to meet partners were also, therefore, more likely to be using the apps as well. But we didn't have any differences in terms of those who lived in or out of New York City or by HIV status. Okay. Any questions there? Yeah.
Just about the yield from the street. So
here?
How did you get such a high? It seems like a lot of the people you randomly approached were MSM or that qualified for your study.
Well, so we are working in Hell's Kitchen and the West Village and Chelsea. So we're in terms of where we were going, we were somewhat targeted towards that particular venue. Yeah.
What time of day?
It was randomized. So some of these were 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night, and some of them were, I forget our earliest shift. It probably wasn't too terribly early, but it was, I think, 10, 11, 12. No, we did not do, I try not to do that to my staff. or to me. I have to sleep every once in a while. Okay? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I was interested in a few more details, like how many people walk by you.
Yeah, we could not really do a good tracking of how many people refused or how many people walked by before we could catch them. What we tried to do was to approach every single person when a staffer was available. So if you're off doing a survey, then obviously there are going to be people passing by. But we often went out on shifts with 4 or 5 guys so that we could do up to 5 surveys at once. Okay. All right. Oh, sorry. Here, next one. So then this leads to the next question. In terms of whether these apps are actually facilitating in any way or are associated with greater numbers of risky behaviors. So to do that, we did an internet survey nationwide using Qualtrics, and it was a larger part of a larger survey that we were conducting, and as part of that, we assessed their total number of sexual partners in the past year, condom use consistency, whether they self-reported STI diagnosis in the past year, and where they had met all of their various partners in the past year. Okay, and so we got a sample of 1,544 who got to the point where they answered the questions on sexual venues. For that, again, a large, all of them were MSM. Hi, Alex. What?
Was that through an app or?
So recruitment-wise, we use a variety of venues. Let me see if I can remember all of them. So we did not use Grindr. We used Black Gay Chat, which is how we got a substantial African American component. We did use Facebook. We did use a couple of different porn sites that volunteered. And I should have put that on the slide because all of my surveys run together at some point. But I'm 90% certain Grindr was not part of one of these. Was not one of the venues for this particular study. So as I mentioned, they're all MSM. We got a substantial number of African American men, in part because of the really successful recruitment from that one particular website. We got men from all 50 states, plus DC and Puerto Rico, and a fairly large number of HIV positive men as well. Okay. And so these are our multivariate findings, looking at number of sex partners using a count of the number of partners they'd had in the past year, so negative binomial regression. And in this, we're controlling for a whole host of variables, but we're also controlling, because men don't go to any single site, they actually are many times using multiple sites. So we entered all of the different places. So it is yes or no, have you met a man for each, so all of these are dichotomized and looking at specifically whether that is associated with their total number of partners. And so as we can see, the men who used websites, the mobile hookup apps, bathhouses, and private sex parties, each independently were all associated with a greater number of sex partners in the past year. Okay? Looking at Inconsistent condom use, comparing those who were always use them versus were inconsistent. We see again and again, controlling for all of these plus other things. We see that mobile apps were associated with greater inconsistency as well as private sex parties as well. And
Can I ask you a question about these slides?
absolutely.
I noticed that you controlled for drug use. Right?
Yes.
Before and after.
Yes.
So I just wondered, why did you use it as control variable as opposed to a predictor?
Because I'm interested in where they're meeting, not drug use as a variable itself. I'm not creating a particular predictive model. I'm really trying to test what is the issues going on here. Where did I leave off? Oh, yeah, moving on. So more inconsistent condom use. And then in terms of self-reported STI diagnosis, again, mobile apps, 3.5 odds, greater odds of having an STI diagnosis. So if we go back again through it, we can see we have a whole lot of venues are related to risk behaviors in various ways, but consistently the mobile apps are the only one that is consistently associated with all three outcomes. Yeah.
So you might talk about this, but I know some of the apps will select out for whether you're interested in condomless sex. Like you can put up an ad saying, I am condomless sex.
Mm-hmm.
We get into that,
not here,
right.
But we get into that more. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. All right. Yeah.
When were you collecting the data, and was it before prep, after prep?
This would have been very early prep. So I think this would have been 2014, 15. Yeah, like that winter. So, yeah.
Question. Did you ask or differentiate between those who use the app and they can report many sexual partners, but those sexual partners stay on the app? Meaning, I meet them through the app, and then I not necessarily have the physical sexual encounter with them. I can have other ways to interact with them, which is not
in person. So this is in terms of our definition to the men that we explicitly defined to them. It had to be an in-person physical encounter that led to orgasm.
Okay, so it has to be in person. The reason I'm asking that is we also know from, I'm thinking about other studies with, as a matter of fact, with adolescent and substance use.
Uh-huh.
And what there is national data now to indicate that the use of app, as a matter of fact, reduces now their interactions with drugs. So the substance use goes down, but what we see, what goes up, is depression and suicide rate.
Doesn't surprise me at all.
And the reason I'm bringing it to the app and the sexual partners through the app, is in my mind, it can be also that if we ask different questions, that we see that for some people, it reduces the risk of sexual encounters and, in fact, HIV infection, et cetera, et cetera.
I would say, one, we're controlling for drug use in the model.
The in-person, because you're going only
Right.
for the in-person, but
Right.
you don't have the data basically to show right now, or maybe to indicate how many are using the apps and not encountering them in person.
Actually might. They're just not here.
No, I know.
So no. I mean, they're in that survey. They just might not be. I just don't have them presented. That's a good question. I could probably see if I have that data. Yeah.
I'm going to interrupt for 1 second just so
Yeah.
we can make sure you can get through your slideshow. So maybe
Yeah.
what we should do is
Yeah.
this seems like a very good
Yeah.
discussion question.
Absolutely.
And so they'll let you get through this and just ask clarifying
Perfect.
questions, if that's okay.
Perfect. So after identifying, after finding in the national survey this kind of consistent pattern of association with risk, variously defined, we started to ask what is going on these apps that might be leading to that might be contributing to the risk. And so we conducted Project Kawa. This was a junior faculty award I received a couple of years ago from Mailman, and where we actually do a content analysis. Specifically, we were interested in how men communicate on the apps and how that might lead to risk. So, in terms of to the extent that there is limited sexual communication prior to having sex, we know from previous research that limited communication can lead to increases in terms of communication about what they want to do, whether they want to use condoms, what their HIV status is, whether they want to use substances while they're in that. All of those are important decision-making tools that, if not discussed, can lead to problems later. Specifically, we've seen it leads to assumptions about whether a condom will be used, assumptions about whether the person is HIV positive or not, also results in more sexual risk behaviors, and actually results in a greater likelihood of HIV infection. So this communication may be particularly limited when we're dealing with web-based and especially mobile-based communication. By all means, the most reliable method of communication is what you actually put out there in the profile itself, because while that conversation that goes on between men prior to meeting relies on asking and telling. And many men tell us in qualitative components of various studies, if he doesn't ask, I'm not going to tell. So we want to get away from that, the reliance on asking and telling. So really the best way is what is in their app profile. But the communication in an app profile is limited in terms of there's word limits, there's few structured questions when people set up these app profiles. Men may be less likely to do actual setting up or actual lengthy discussion or lengthy profile discussions of what they're looking for, given the keyboard constraints of a mobile device. And all of that then can lead to less information on which to base sexual partnering decisions. Okay, so the research that we did was looking at communication, and specifically communication through the app profile itself, to see whether that might be a potential method or a potential reason why there were more partners and more sexual risks. So specifically, we compared the content of app profiles versus the content of more traditional website-based hookup profiles. And specifically, we looked for differences in the partner, what type of partner they were looking for, what type of sexual behavior they were looking for, whether condom use was mentioned in the profile, whether they mentioned their HIV status, whether they mentioned substance use, as well as any potential demographic differences. And so we collected 1,000 profiles. 4 were excluded from the websites from analysis. The profiles were drawn from the 9 most popular apps and websites identified in our Street-Intercept survey earlier. So these 4 apps and these 5 websites. Specifically, again, because of the GPS capability of the apps, we had to go physically to the neighborhood to get profiles from that particular neighborhood. And so we represented 10 different neighborhoods, including neighborhoods both in Manhattan and the outer boroughs, and trying to seek ethnic minority enclave neighborhoods as well as non-minority neighborhoods. So Washington Heights, Harlem was and were one of our were some of our neighborhoods. We randomized when we would go out in terms of the time of day, the day of the week, as well as whether it was an app or a website, and then what neighborhood we would send folks out to. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did the user get consent?
There is no consent because it is a publicly posted profile for anyone to see. So we made that argument to the IRB, and they agreed. I was a little concerned too, and we did a number of tech. Security issues in terms of it's not stored on the cloud. We downloaded we collected them off of iPads so that it was a bigger screenshot, and then we would take them immediately back here and download them off of the device so that there wasn't a whole lot. But it really is information that men are already putting out there for potential partners to see. And the reason we like quantitative content analysis in part is because unlike our surveys that I've talked about before and our qualitative interviews that we mentioned, that I'll talk about later, it totally eliminates this self-presentation effect for the researchers. Oh, well, I should use condoms. I should mention, of course I mention my HIV status. Of course I talk about condom use in my profile. Well, in fact, we find that that's actually, for the most part, not the case when you actually look at the profiles in real life. We used standard content analysis coding procedures where we set up a coding system and a data collection sheet that we developed based on the first 100 profiles and then coded all 1,000 profiles, looking for the total number of words in the profile, condom use preferences, HIV, sexual behavior, substance use, and demographics. And so looking then at comparing profiles from the apps as well as the websites, we see dramatic differences in what men are talking about or even talking anything about in apps versus more traditional websites. We see the total number of words in the profiles dramatically differ in terms of HIV status mentions. They were far less likely to do that in an app than in more traditional websites. Again, far less likely to mention condoms. Whether that's pro-condom or no condom, whatever it was, they didn't mention it. It was not discussed. So there was a lack of communication. What they were looking for in terms of oral, anal, or group sex, again, not mentioned in the profiles. In terms of sexual positioning, again, significantly less likely to be mentioned. Men were far less likely to be mentioning long-term relationships, but then we also see they were less likely to also mention no strings attached relationships. So we see so it's both risky communication and non-risky communication are lower in the apps regardless. One difference there is the men on the apps were more likely to report, at least, seeking dates and just looking to chat online. I don't know what to make of that particular finding at this point, given it completely contradicts some findings that I'll be presenting in a couple of minutes, assuming I have time. Yeah, okay. And then, again, substance use not mentioned. We did see an age difference in app users being somewhat younger. We also saw ethnic differences, with African American men more likely to use the websites. That's primarily because of the popularity of BGC. Over the apps. And then Asian men were also more likely to use the apps. Both of those were significant. But other things that we wouldn't expect to differ did not differ. So height and weight of for all the profiles were nearly identical. In terms of outness, however that was defined, whether it was out or DL or whatever, again, was also not mentioned on the apps. So this gives us a whole feeling of, is there something going on here in terms of are there decisions being made with potential sex partners that are happening without a lot of discussion and without a lot of information. So we also have further data from the qualitative component of our R21 that further puts light on some of these findings. So we conducted in-depth qualitative interviews with a subset of the men from the Street-Intercept survey. We brought them in for a CASI and a qualitative interview. And the participants specifically were asked to compare their experiences of apps and websites, to discuss their reasons for why they use apps and websites, what they look for in the profiles and how that might differ between the two, and how they present themselves and communicate with potential partners on apps and websites and whether that differs. So I don't have all of those data completely done yet, but we have a good chunk. Specifically, we had 60 men come in. We quota sampled so that they were equal numbers of Black, Latino, and white men. The majority were gay identified, and then we oversampled for HIV positive men. Again, to get enough men to kind of understand their specific experiences as well. Okay, so in terms of what we found when we talk with men about their use is that there's a very specific and distinct, what I call app culture. One could also call it the sexual script of how apps should be used. And specifically, men talked about how men on the apps were looking for immediate sex. They tried to present themselves in a way that was most likely to attract sexual partners. This is this online marketplace. If you don't have the goods to attract a buyer, then you're not going to get your reward. There is an active dislike of communication on the apps, and the communication that does take place is purely for the specific purpose of assessing sexual compatibility and when and where we're going to meet. So a few quotes to illustrate these points in terms of immediate sex. The app, because it's right there, convenient to your finger, it's faster. At that moment, you don't want to wait. Your behavior changes a little bit. I mean, it's not about having a conversation. It's about meeting somebody at that time. Your whole behavior, everything changes. With the app, I think it's much easier because maybe 50% of the time you're going to find at least 2 or 3 people that are willing to do something at that moment. Oh, sorry. In terms of this self-presentation effect that we talked about, that I mentioned earlier, I think there's this whole thing where people only present. There's this grinder performance when people present this very basic surface version of themselves, which in the most drastic ways makes a fast fucking go pretty easy and emotionless if it needs to be that. In terms of dislike of communication, because, like I said, it's a hookup app. That's what I'm looking for. I'm not going to be there to chit-chat from those apps. What I'm looking for is basically to have sex with that person. That's it. I'm not going to go for a cup of coffee or tea or a drink before having a sexual encounter with that person. It's strictly a hookup. Let's get down to business. Boom, let's just do it. And then in terms of how that communication might facilitate risk, all I can say is, can you send more pics? Where are you? What are you looking to do? What are you into? Bear is more top. You're more top. How hung? You're looking for it now? Then I say, I'm looking for it now. Send the address. They send the address. When you get there, you just do it. I've never been asked to use a condom. We don't get to the point of, are we using a condom? Do you have poppers and lube? I don't know. They just don't ask if I have condoms. It's more like, do you have lube and poppers? Okay. So this is all giving us this feeling of this culture of quick and easy sex with limited or no communication. And as such, maybe it may be one of the many things that's facilitating risk. So in terms of the quick summary of what we've seen so far, we see that the app use is widespread but not universal. Bars are still in play. Apps have not replaced bars or websites as a venue. In fact, it's more likely just added to the menu of potential sexual venues that MSM are using to meet potential partners. Compared to other venues, the men using the apps do report more partners, less consistent condom use, and more likely to self-report STI infection. There's also a lack of communication on the apps, both in terms of their profiles from our content analysis, as well as in the chat from our qualitative analysis. Neither one communication does not seem to be a particular priority, and so that app culture may be contributing to the greater risk that we're seeing from the men on the apps. Okay, so what does this mean for all of us when we're doing HIV prevention work? First, I think the main thing I take home is that we can't move entirely to app-based interventions. The work that we've been doing over the past 20 years in terms of websites and bars and bathhouses and sex parties are still relevant and still are being used by MSM, and therefore we can't abandon those ongoing efforts. But what we do need to do is translate some of those efforts to make them relevant to this new additional venue for app users. Now, the high-risk behaviors that we do see on the apps could be due to something in the app itself, like limited communication. It could be the culture of the place that we've seen, or it may simply be that the apps are the new it thing, and that is where men who would be doing quick sexual connections anyhow are simply gravitating to the app because it indeed it allows for that better than other technologies. So I won't say that I'm completely convinced that it's the apps themselves. However, there is a number of things that do suggest that there are components of the apps themselves that do potentially contribute in addition to the attractiveness of the venue. Okay? So that suggests that we need to work with to work on structural changes with the app developers themselves. Specifically, it would be nice if we could get, and we've seen some of this in the past year, in terms of creating more structured questions that specifically ask men to self-report whether they're looking for condom use, whether they're on PrEP, what is their HIV status. So that has been implemented in Grindr and some of the other apps more recently. So that may be critical because, again, having those conversations about are we going to do this, are we not going to do this, are always prone to potential failure, as we can see in the qualitative data. So to the extent that that can be prompted for in the profile. Now, that doesn't force anyone to fill it out, so we do see a number of things, a number of places where, or we can see that is not a foolproof solution, but it is one potential goal. Okay, this work, of course, is ongoing. We're still writing up we're still analyzing the qualitative data and writing those up. We have a number of these papers are still in the works, and we also have ACASI data from our in-depth interview participants comparing their behaviors on the apps and websites that we still have yet to fully analyze. Okay, but this work has facilitated spun off a number of additional projects from that original R21 and from that Junior Faculty Award development. We have gone on to do a number of other things. Specifically, one of my other sets of work is looking at the role of pornography and how that may be, so another type of technology communication, and how that might be creating specific sexual scripts that men are following or using as sources of information. And we have a number of data sets that we have that we've been collecting for that particular project. We also have my team is here. We also have our current R01. Looking at, which is a longitudinal mixed methods design, looking at young MSM 16 to 25. And specifically there, we're interested in their sexual scripts and specifically their PrEP scripts. Talking with guys about what are the different messages they get from the larger society and from the community, including what messages do they get from porn, what messages do they get from interacting with guys on the apps, from their gay and straight friends, from school-based sex ed, and how do they make sense of the often the discrepant messages that they get from those different sources. So we're continuing this kind of app. What are the influence of app and porn, and as well as other sources, and how those all together are helping young men create their intrapsychic scripts that guide their behavior. And that project is still in data collection. Okay. We also have a brand new project funded in September that's looking at male sex workers who use the apps and other non-sex work websites to meet their clients. So this is a mixed methods design that then will facilitate the design of interventions that will also be explored. There we're looking at 180 MSM, all of whom have engaged in sex work with a partner that they've met either on an app or a website. And there we're really interested in how has the migration of sex work off the streets and off of sex work specific websites like Rent Boy, which was closed down a few years ago, and now that they've migrated to non-sex work-based apps and websites, we had originally planned to include Craigslist. Those plans got changed. And how has that changed the nature of male sex work? Specifically, are the apps a new pathway into sex work? Whereas men who are never had thought anything about sex work, could they be propositioned or solicited on an app and therefore said, oh, well, if I'm worth that, then maybe that's something I could explore and get into. We'll also be looking at how that has changed, how sex work is negotiated, what kind of risk reduction strategies they use with both their sex work and non-sex work partners, as well as the types of interventions that they would be interested in having now that this work has all moved online. And that will be entering into data collection this summer. Okay. Of course, I have a huge, as has already been mentioned, I have a huge team of students and staff who have helped with all of this, specifically Rachel Gordon, the PI of the large national survey, and several people whose names you'll recognize. Dr. Carolyn Siegel and our team for the R21 for both the Street-Intercept and the qualitative component, and then my team of students who did the content analysis. I want to thank all of them. And then that's it for me. I would love to answer questions because I think some of this is still very preliminary, and I think I kind of breezed through 4 studies rather quickly. So any questions you might have?
First of all, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mind-blowing. So, people just raise your hand so I can try to. Okay, and Effie has a question from before.
Right.
Effie, do you want to go first and finish your question?
Yeah, well, it was just an observational
Absolutely.
comment here. But I think that it will be very interesting that if you look at the whole users of the app, and maybe, just maybe, I'm just thinking as hypothesis, that for some, the app now decreases the risk, and they can have multiple partners. Again, show me what you have. This is, and I want it now. I don't have to run to the subway to get you in another half an hour.
Right.
Which makes me also leading to the next comment that I would like to see a little bit of a psychological profile of the users, because when you were talking and giving, I want it now, right now, I was thinking about impulsivity.
Absolutely.
I wonder